The train screeched to a halt at Willow Creek Station as the sky darkened ominously, leaving Penelope Adams alone on the wooden platform with nothing but two weathered trunks and a letter promising a future with a man she'd never met. It was May of 1875, and at 22, she had traveled over 2,000 miles from Boston to this remote corner of Wyoming territory to marry a stranger. "Last stop, madam," the conductor called, tipping his hat before retreating to the warmth of the train. "Station master should be along shortly." Penelope nodded, clutching her shawl against the rising wind. Her chestnut hair, once neatly pinned, now whipped around her face as she scanned the empty platform for any sign of her intended husband Miles Donovan, cattle rancher, and, according to his letters, a man of gentle disposition despite his rugged profession. The distant rumble of thunder made her heart sink. Miles had promised to meet her train, yet here she stood alone as the first raindrops began to fall. "Miss, you'd best come inside," called an elderly man who emerged from the small station house. "Storm's coming fast." These Wyoming spring storms can turn mean. Grateful, Penelope followed him inside the modest building. "My name is Penelope Adams. I'm supposed to be meeting Mr. Miles Donovan." The station master's bushy eyebrows rose. "The Donovan Ranch is 15 miles east. Mighty peculiar he ain't here." "He knew you were coming today." "Yes, sir. We've exchanged letters for 6 months." She retrieved the most recent letter from her reticule, the paper soft from countless readings. "He said he'd be waiting when my train arrived." The old man glanced outside as rain began pelting the windows. "Can't imagine what's keeping him, but he won't be traveling in this. You're welcome to wait here, Miss Adams." Hours passed. The rain transformed into sheets of water that obscured the world beyond the station's windows. Occasionally, lightning illuminated the empty street of Willow Creek, a town that seemed to consist of little more than a general store, a saloon, and a handful of clapboard buildings. "Perhaps there's a boarding house where I could stay," Penelope finally asked, her voice tight with anxiety. The station master, who'd introduced himself as Harold Jenkins, shook his head. "Nearest one's in Cheyenne, I'm afraid. Town's too small for such conveniences." By nightfall, Penelope's hope had dwindled. Mr. Jenkins offered her a chair by the potbelly stove and a cup of weak coffee. "If he doesn't turn up by morning, I'll send word to the Donovan place," he promised. "Thank you," she whispered, fighting back tears. 6 months of letters. 6 months of sharing hopes and dreams with a man who had seemed so reliable on paper. She'd left everything behind: her position as a seamstress, her tiny room in a Boston boarding house, her few friends, all for the promise of a life with Miles Donovan. What if he'd changed his mind? What if the letters had been nothing more than a cruel game? Sleep came in fitful bursts, punctuated by the howling wind and crashing thunder. The storm raged through the night, battering the small station as if determined to sweep it away entirely. Morning brought no relief. The rain continued unabated, and Penelope struggled to maintain her composure as she watched Mr. Jenkins prepare another pot of coffee. "Storm's got the telegraph lines down," he informed her grimly. "Can't send word to the Donovan place." By noon, Penelope had resigned herself to abandonment. Her funds were limited, just enough for emergency passage back east if necessary. The thought of returning in disgrace made her stomach clench, but what choice did she have? The door to the station burst open just as this thought crossed her mind, sending a spray of rainwater across the wooden floor. A tall figure stood in the doorway, water cascading from a wide-brimmed hat and long oilskin coat. "Sorry I'm late," said a deep voice as the man removed his hat, revealing dark hair plastered to his forehead and earnest blue eyes. Water dripped from every inch of him, forming a puddle on the floor. Penelope stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. "Miles Donovan," he said, crossing the room in 3 long strides and extending a hand that was surprisingly warm despite his drenched state. "You must be Miss Adams." Yes," she managed, taking his hand briefly. "I was beginning to think you weren't coming." His face darkened with genuine remorse. "Creek flooded yesterday, washed out the bridge. Had to ride 20 miles around, then the horse went lame. Ended up walking the last 5 miles. He ran a hand through his wet hair, sending droplets flying. "Reckon that's not the welcome you were expecting." Despite everything, Penelope found herself smiling. "No, Mr. Donovan, it wasn't. "Call me Miles, please," he said, returning her smile with one that transformed his weather-beaten face. "I've been picturing this moment for months, though I'll admit I wasn't planning on resembling a drowned rat when we met." Mr. Jenkins chuckled from his corner. "Best get this young lady out of here, Donovan. She's been waiting near a full day." "My wagon's outside," Miles said, turning serious. "Storms eased some, but we should head out while we can. It's a rough journey in good weather." Anxiety fluttered in Penelope's chest. This moment leaving with this stranger to become his wife was what she had traveled across the country for, yet now that it had arrived, fear threatened to overwhelm her. Miles must have sensed her hesitation. "Miss Adams, I know this is sudden, meeting like this after only letters. If you've had second thoughts, I understand. There's a stage back east next week." His directness surprised her. The Miles from the letters had been thoughtful and considerate, and here was that same quality in the flesh giving her a choice when many men would simply expect her compliance. "No second thoughts," she said firmly, "just first meeting nerves." His relief was visible. "Well then, let's get your trunks loaded." The journey to the Donovan ranch was every bit as challenging as Miles had warned. The wagon lurched through mud-filled ruts, and twice they had to stop to clear fallen branches from their path. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the sky remained leaden and threatening. As they traveled, Miles spoke of his ranch, 500 acres with a modest herd of cattle, a vegetable garden that could use a woman's touch, and a house he'd built with his own hands. "It's not fancy," he admitted, "but it's solid. 3 rooms with a root cellar, been adding to it bit by bit." "It sounds lovely," Penelope replied, though in truth she could barely imagine it. Her life in Boston had been confined to crowded tenements and the dress shop where she'd worked 14-hour days. "What about your family?" Miles asked. "Your letters mentioned you were an orphan, but was there no one to see you off?" Penelope shook her head. "My parents died of influenza when I was 16. I've been on my own since then." Miles nodded solemnly. "Lost my pa to a cattle stampede when I was 18, ma to pneumonia 3 years later. Been running the ranch alone since." He glanced at her, his expression softening. "Guess we both know something about being alone." The simple statement created a bridge between them, an understanding that went beyond the polite conversation of strangers. As afternoon waned, they crested a hill, and Miles pulled the wagon to a stop. "There it is," he said, pointing to a valley below where a modest cabin stood near a small creek, surrounded by rolling grassland that stretched toward distant mountains. Donovan Ranch. The sight caught Penelope's breath. After the cramped confines of Boston, the openness was both terrifying and exhilarating. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. Miles beamed with pride. "It's not much yet, but with hard work." He trailed off, suddenly looking uncertain. "I hope it won't be too much of a disappointment. I know ladies from the East are used to finer things." "Mr. Donovan, Miles, I wasn't born to luxury. I've worked as a seamstress since I was 16. Hard work doesn't frighten me." The relief on his face was palpable. "Then welcome home, Miss Adams." As they approached the cabin, a black and white border collie raced out to greet them, barking enthusiastically. "That's Scout," Miles explained. "Best cattle dog in the territory and the closest thing I've had to company these past years." The cabin was indeed small but surprisingly cozy inside. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by shelves filled with books, an unexpected sight that made Penelope smile. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a simple wooden table, 4 chairs, and a rocking chair near the fire. 2 doors led off to what Penelope assumed were bedrooms. Miles busied himself lighting a fire while Penelope stood uncertainly in the middle of the room. "I've prepared the spare room for you," he said, gesturing to one of the doors. "I thought I figured until we're properly married you'd want your privacy." The consideration touched her deeply. How many men would have expected immediate husbandly rights upon a mail-order bride's arrival? "Thank you," she said softly. "When do you think we might arrange the wedding?" Miles straightened from the fireplace. "Preacher comes through once a month, should be here next week, but Miss Adams, I want to be clear about something." He crossed to stand before her, his expression serious. "Our arrangement was for marriage, but I won't hold you to it if this," he gestured around the cabin, "isn't what you expected. You can stay as my guest until the next stage, no strings attached." Penelope studied him, this tall, lean man with calloused hands and kind eyes. Everything about him matched the person she'd come to know through his letters: honest, direct, considerate. "I'd like to honor our arrangement," she said, "but perhaps we could take this week to get to know each other better." His smile warmed her more than the crackling fire. "I'd like that very much." The week that followed established a tentative rhythm between them. Penelope rose early each morning to prepare breakfast before Miles left to tend the cattle. She spent her days exploring the cabin and its surroundings, mending clothes that had clearly been neglected for too long, and preparing meals from the surprisingly well-stocked pantry. Miles returned each evening, tired but eager to share his day. They ate dinner together by lamplight, their conversations gradually becoming less formal, more comfortable. On the third night, as they sat before the fire, Miles asked, "Why did you answer my advertisement, Miss Adams, truthfully?" Penelope considered the question. "Security at first," she admitted. "A seamstress's wages barely cover room and board. The future looked bleak." She paused. "But then came your letters. You wrote about this land with such passion, about building something lasting. It stirred something in me, a desire for more than just survival." Miles nodded slowly. "And now that you're here, is it what you hoped for?" "It's different," she said carefully. "Bigger, wilder than I imagined, but also more beautiful." She met his gaze. "And you, Mr. Donovan, why seek a bride from so far away?" He poked at the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. "Loneliness, partly. Running a ranch alone isn't just hard work, it's solitary work." He looked up at her. "But also, I want what my parents had. They came out here with nothing but each other and built something good, something true." The simple honesty of his words touched something deep inside her. In Boston, the men she'd encountered had viewed her as either invisible or merely convenient. Miles really saw her. On the fourth day, a sudden spring snowstorm confined them to the cabin. Miles taught Penelope how to play checkers, and she shared stories of Boston that made him laugh. When their hands accidentally touched while reaching for the same checker piece, neither pulled away immediately. The fifth day brought sunshine and the first opportunity for Miles to show Penelope the full extent of the ranch. They rode double on his gelding, Penelope seated in front of Miles, acutely aware of his arm around her waist as he pointed out landmarks. "That ridge marks the northern boundary," he explained, his breath warm against her ear. "Beyond that is Johnson's spread. Good neighbor, helped me through my first winter. South and east is all Donovan land down to the creek." Penelope tried to concentrate on his words rather than the solid warmth of his chest against her back. "It's much larger than I imagined." "Too large for one man," Miles said quietly. "That's the truth of it. A ranch needs a family to truly prosper." That evening, as they watched the sunset from the porch, Miles tentatively reached for her hand. Penelope allowed him to take it, surprised at how natural it felt. "I know it's only been a few days," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "but I feel like I've known you much longer." "The letters," Penelope suggested. Miles nodded. 6 months of putting my thoughts on paper, never been much for writing before, but somehow writing to you came easy." "I kept every letter," she confessed, his fingers tightened around hers. "So did I." On the 6th day, disaster struck. Miles returned from checking the herd with a deep gash in his arm, his shirt soaked with blood. "Barbed wire," he explained through gritted teeth as Penelope helped him inside. "New fence line broke loose in the wind." Working quickly, Penelope cleaned the wound with whiskey from Miles's small supply, her hands steady despite her racing heart. The gash was deep but clean. "Needs stitching," she said, meeting his eyes. Miles nodded grimly. "There's a medical kit in the trunk under my bed." Pa insisted every rancher know basic doctoring. Penelope found the kit, complete with catgut and needles. "I've never done this before," she admitted, threading the needle with slightly trembling hands. "Makes 2 of us," Miles said, attempting a smile that turned into a wince. "But I trust you, Penny." The nickname spoken so naturally in this moment of pain made her heart skip. Focusing on the task, she took a deep breath and began to stitch. Miles remained stoic throughout, his only reaction an occasional sharp intake of breath. When she finished, tying off the last stitch neatly as she would a fine seam, he exhaled slowly. "You've got a steady hand," he said, examining her work. "Would have made a fine doctor." "Women aren't allowed to be doctors," she replied automatically. Miles looked up at her, his eyes serious despite the pain. Says who? Out here you become what you need to be, nothing more, nothing less. That night, Penelope insisted on sleeping in the chair beside Miles's bed, afraid the wound might worsen. She dozed fitfully, waking often to check his forehead for fever. Shortly before dawn, she woke to find him watching her, his eyes clear and fever-free. "You stayed," he said softly. "Of course." "No of course about it," he replied. "Most people I've known don't stick around when things get difficult." Penelope straightened in the uncomfortable chair. "I'm not most people, Mr. Donovan." A smile spread across his face. "No, you certainly are not, Miss Adams." By the 7th day, the day before the preacher's expected arrival, Miles's arm was healing well, and an unspoken tension had developed between them. The wedding loomed, bringing with it expectations neither had voiced aloud. That evening after dinner, Miles cleared his throat nervously. "I've been thinking, Penny, Miss Adams." "Penny is fine," she said quickly, liking the way the nickname sounded in his deep voice. He nodded, seeming to gather courage. "Penny, then, I've been thinking about tomorrow, about the preacher coming." Her heart fluttered. "Yes. I want you to know that nothing has to change right away. That is," he ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "What I'm trying to say is that being married on paper doesn't mean, well, it doesn't have to mean, I understand," Penelope interrupted, saving him from his uncomfortable stammering. "You're saying we can be married but continue as we are until we're both ready for more." The relief on his face was evident. "Exactly. I want this to be right, Penny, not just legal but right." Later that night, alone in her room, Penelope reflected on the week that had passed. She had arrived a stranger, expecting at best a cordial arrangement with a man she knew only through letters. Yet in 7 short days, Miles Donovan had shown himself to be everything his letters had promised and more hardworking, honest, considerate, and unexpectedly gentle for a man who wrestled cattle and battled the elements daily. Was it possible to fall in love so quickly? Or was she simply grateful to have found decency in a man when she had expected so little? The morning brought clear skies and the sound of hoofbeats as Reverend Thomas Patterson arrived, his ancient mare picking her way carefully up the muddy path to the cabin. Miles Donovan. The preacher called, dismounting with the agility of a much younger man. "Heard you finally found yourself a bride." Miles emerged from the barn, hat in hand. "News travels fast, Reverend. Mrs. Johnson mentioned it when I stopped at their place. Said she was a proper Boston lady who'd be civilizing you at last." The Reverend chuckled. "Where is this brave woman?" Penelope stepped onto the porch, wearing her best dress, a simple blue cotton that she'd spent the previous evening altering to better fit her slender frame. "Reverend Patterson, may I present Miss Penelope Adams," Miles said formally. The Reverend's eyes twinkled as he took in Penelope. "A pleasure, my dear. Ready to take on this wild man and his wilderness?" Penelope smiled, surprisingly at ease. "I believe I am, Reverend." The ceremony was brief but meaningful. Standing before the fireplace, with Scout as their only witness, Penelope and Miles exchanged vows, promises to honor, respect, and care for one another until death parted them. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Miles hesitated only briefly before leaning down to place a gentle kiss on Penelope's lips there first. It was soft and warm and over too quickly, leaving Penelope's heart racing and her cheeks flushed. After a simple meal, the Reverend departed with promises to return the following month. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, a strange silence fell over the cabin. "Well, Mrs. Donovan," Miles said finally, the name sounding both foreign and right, "what shall we do with our wedding day?" Penelope looked around the cabin that was now officially her home. "I'd like to plant something," she said suddenly, "in our garden, something that will grow with our marriage." Miles's face lit up. "I've got apple seedlings in the root cellar, been saving them for the right moment." Together they selected a spot near the cabin where the future tree would provide shade in summer. Working side by side, they dug the hole, prepared the soil, and carefully planted the seedling. "My mother always said apple trees are like marriages," Miles said as they patted the soil around the fragile stem. "They need tending, patience, and deep roots to bear good fruit." "How long before it produces apples?" Penelope asked. 5 years, maybe 6. He glanced at her. "Worth waiting for, though." That night, true to his word, Miles kissed her cheek at her bedroom door and retired to his own room. Penelope lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie night and thinking about the days and weeks and years that stretched ahead. A month passed, then two. Spring deepened into summer, and the rhythm of ranch life became familiar to Penelope. She learned to make soap from tallow, to preserve vegetables for winter, and to identify the wild herbs that grew on the hillsides. Miles taught her to ride and, after much persuasion, to shoot the rifle he kept for protection. Their evenings together lengthened as they became more comfortable sharing thoughts and dreams. Miles spoke of expanding the herd, building a larger house someday. Penelope shared her hope of starting a small business making clothes for neighboring ranchers' wives, who currently had to travel to Cheyenne for new garments. Their kisses grew longer, more frequent, though Miles never pressured her for more. Each night, he escorted her to her door with increasing reluctance. In July, a letter arrived from Boston. Penelope's friend Sarah had tracked down her whereabouts. The letter was full of city gossip and veiled questions about Penelope's situation. Was she truly happy in such a remote place? Was her husband kind? Sitting on the porch that evening, watching Miles repair a saddle by lamplight, Penelope realized she had never replied to Sarah's questions in her own mind. "Miles," she said softly, "are you happy with our arrangement?" His hand stilled on the leather. "You mean our marriage?" "Yes, is it? Is it what you hoped for when you sent for a bride?" Miles set the saddle aside and turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "It's more than I hoped for, Penny. Every day I wake up grateful that you were brave enough to answer that advertisement, to travel all this way to meet a stranger." He hesitated. "But I should be asking you that question. Are you happy here, so far from everything familiar?" Penelope considered the vast differences between her life in Boston and her life here: the endless sky instead of crowded streets, the physical labor instead of bent-back sewing, the solitude instead of anonymous crowds. "I am happy," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Happier than I've been since my parents died. I feel useful here, necessary, and not alone." She met his gaze. "With you I never feel alone." Miles reached for her hand, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "Penny, I've been trying to be patient, to give you time to be sure. But I need to tell you I've fallen in love with you. Not just the idea of you from the letters, but you, the woman who stitched my arm without flinching, who sings to herself while making bread, who talks to that apple seedling as if it can hear you." Penelope's heart raced. "Miles, you don't have to say anything back," he interrupted. "I just couldn't keep it inside anymore." She moved closer, placing her free hand against his weathered cheek. "I love you too, Miles Donovan. I think I started falling in love with the man in those letters, and I've only fallen deeper since meeting him in person." The kiss that followed was different from all their previous ones: deeper, unrestrained, full of the feelings they'd both been carefully containing. When they finally parted, breathless, Miles rested his forehead against hers. "Penny Donovan, would you do me the honor of sharing my room from now on?" Her answer was another kiss, and that night the spare bedroom remained empty. Years passed, each season bringing its own challenges and joys. The apple seedling grew into a sturdy young tree. The herd expanded, allowing Miles to hire a ranch hand to help with the increasing work. Penelope's seamstress business flourished, with women traveling from neighboring ranches to commission her skilled work. In the winter of 1877, their first child was born, a daughter they named Mary, after Miles's mother. She was followed 2 years later by a son, James, who had Penelope's chestnut hair and Miles's blue eyes. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as they sat beneath the apple tree that had produced its first small crop of fruit, Miles presented Penelope with a journal bound in soft leather. "What's this?" she asked, running her fingers over the cover. "Found it in Cheyenne last month," he explained. "Thought you might like to write our story, how a Boston seamstress and a Wyoming rancher built a life together." "It's perfect," she said, leaning against his shoulder as the children played nearby with Scout, now gray-muzzled but still vigilant. "Any regrets?" Miles asked quietly. "About answering my advertisement." Penelope considered the question seriously, as she always did. "Only one," she finally replied. Miles raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I sometimes wish I hadn't had to wait through that terrible storm at the station, wondering if you'd changed your mind." She smiled up at him. But then, I might not have appreciated quite so much when you arrived dripping wet and apologizing for being late. Miles laughed, pulling her closer. Best apology I ever made, considering what it got me. As the sun set over Donovan Ranch, casting long shadows across land that had sustained them through seasons of plenty and hardship alike, Penelope silently thanked the young woman she had been the one brave enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to journey into the unknown on the strength of a few promising letters. That evening, as the children slept and rain once again pattered against the windows of the larger house Miles had built with his own hands, Penelope opened the new journal and wrote on the first page. It began with a storm, a dripping cowboy, and an apology. It continues day by day with love.